Bom, muito boa tarde a todos e todas. É um prazer estar aqui mais uma vez com vocês nessa terça-feira. Hoje, com mais um encontro do Fórum Permanente sobre Genocídio e Crimes contra a Humanidade. Hoje, com o palestrante, o senhor Soleiman Marmutov, para falar no tema Uprooted, The Crimean Tatar Genocide of 1944. Ele é o responsável pela legislação ucraniana sobre os direitos dos povos indígenas. Foi eleito para o Fórum Permanente da ONU com a relação aos indígenas e ele sendo membro especialista desde 2022 e relator desde 2024. Além disso, colabora com a Anistia Internacional, a Ucrânia e a OSCE para o avanço dos direitos dos povos indígenas e a promoção da justiça internacional. O principal alvo da palestra dele e o principal alvo dos estudos dele são cultura, língua e os tártaros da Crimeia no geral. O que é um tema bastante interessante para a gente do fórum e do grupo de pesquisas, né, o GPIM, por tratar especialmente num grupo de trabalho especificamente sobre povos indígenas. Então, e eu especialmente com um capítulo do meu doutorado acabou sendo em que eu falei um pouco sobre os tártaros da Crimeia. Então, it's a pleasure to have you here, Mr. Mamutov. I'm just saying that it's a pleasure for us in general and for me in special because my PhD work, one chapter of my PhD work, my thesis was about the Crimean Tatars. So it's a pleasure to have you here. And the floor is yours. Please, you may begin.
Thank you so much for this kind of invitation. It's an honor to speak to you today, and hello everyone. Today I want to share some reflections about a topic that is both historical and deeply relevant today. I'll talk about the mass deportations that took place under Stalin's regime, focusing on the Crimean Tatars and how these events echo in the current war of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, especially when we look at it through the lens of indigenous people's rights. So, if you allow, let me start with a bit about myself. For more than 10 years, I've worked on the rights of indigenous peoples globally and nationally. I worked with also with international organizations on issues related to international humanitarian law, protection of civilians, displacement, and recently the mine action policy in Ukraine, because many lands are contaminated and it will take even like many decades to release them. In 2022, I was elected as an expert member to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I was elected by the UN Economic and Social Council. And I became, at that time, the first Crimean Tatar, or Kurumle, and the first person from Ukraine to join the forum in the capacity of expert member. The forum is the UN's, I could say, main advisory body on indigenous peoples. It comprises of 16 experts from 7 global regions. And every year, the forum holds a major session where indigenous voices from all over the world come together. And I must say it's one of the most inclusive UN spaces for indigenous peoples that exists today. To my surprise, by the way, Brazil hasn't had a representative expert in recent terms. So the forum members, they are re-elected every 3 years, but not more than twice. And I hope that this will change in the future. As a Fórum member, I help highlight the issues indigenous peoples face and the work they do to protect their cultures, lands, identities, their right to self-determination according to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In 2024, and again this year, I was elected rapporteur of the Fórum. That means that I was responsible for drafting our annual report, summarizing hundreds of interventions and proposals. And here I learned the lesson about the UN, and in particular about the UN Forum on Indigenous Issues. It's one of its greatest strengths, and at the same time, challenge is the consensus. The Forum makes decisions by consensus, and all 16 experts must agree. Sometimes that's easy, like when we talk about climate change or deforestation and the impact on indigenous peoples. But when it comes to human rights, and especially the collective rights of indigenous peoples, things get complicated. And sometimes we spend hours debating a single sentence or even a single word, but it's worth it because the result is something we all own then. Now let me bring us to the main theme of today, the indigenous peoples and colonization in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and its part, Crimea. It still surprises many people when I say that there are indigenous peoples in Europe, because most people associate the term indigenous with Africa, with North America, South America, Pacific region, but not with Caucasus or Crimea. And part of this comes from an old idea in international law, which is called blue water thesis. It's said that for a people to be decolonized, there had to be ocean, or at least some big geographic divide between them and the colonizer. And this theory invented to stop the decolonization of Native Americans in the United States, but was later used by the Soviet Union to suggest that colonization inside its borders wasn't real colonization. And the Russian and Soviet officials claimed their colonization of Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Crimea was somehow more civilized, less brutal than European colonization of Africa, for example. But the peoples that Russia colonized, they tell a different story. And this story includes land dispossession, forced assimilation, deportations, forced exiles, boarding schools, suppression of language, culture, these key elements of identity. And I think you would agree that it sounds familiar because it's the same pattern that is repeated across many continents. So my homeland and the homeland of Crimean Tatars, Crimea, indigenous peoples of Ukraine, and there are two more indigenous peoples of Ukraine, the Karaites and Krimchaks. The Crimean Tatars were formed through centuries of cultural mixing from different various tribes, and over the history, they built their own statehoods, Theodoric, Manio, and the Crimean Khanate. But just long story short, by the 18th century, their power, the power of the state of Crimean Tatars, Crimean Khanate, was declining. And after losing wars with the Russian Empire, Crimea was annexed. And that was beginning of our colonization. The Crimean Tatars, they lost land, schools, they were pushed out by waves of settlers settlers, and by early 20th century, they had become a minority in their homeland. In 1917, there was a brief moment of hope because Crimean Tatars proclaimed Crimean People's Republic with a constitution, equal rights, and even women's suffrage. But it didn't last. A year later, the Red Army invaded and this republic was destroyed. Its leader, Numan Çelebi was executed. In 1920s, the new Soviet state tried a policy of indigenization. This policy offered limited cultural autonomy, but this too was reversed under Stalin after 1944, which is May 1944 is the darkest chapter of our history because on May 18, the entire Crimean Tatar population was forcibly deported. Nearly like more than 200,000 people, men, women, children, boys, girls, elders, they were loaded into cattle wagons, and their destination was primarily Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, but also to Ural. This journey lasted weeks. Many died on the way, and even more during the first year after the deportation due to the unbearable conditions, absence of normal hygiene kits, forced labor, and the official reason for this deportation by the Soviet regime was an alleged collaboration with Nazi Germany. So this was a pretext because at the same time, the irony is that more than 9,000 Crimean Tatars had served in Soviet army, and when they returned home from the front lines, they were deported too. Those who were not deported, they had to find their families in Central Asia. And this shows like the truth that this deportation was collective punishment, ethnic cleansing, and a crime against humanity. Because even by Soviet statistics, more than 20% of deportees died. Our records, the records of Crimean Tatar national movement, show that this figure is much higher, around 46% of those who were deported could not survive. That's nearly half of people. And what makes it even more chilling is that for decades after, Crimean Tatars were not allowed to return. From 1944 to the late 1980s, they lived in exile. Me, myself, I was born in Tashkent, in Uzbekistan, in deportation, like my parents. And like until 1956, Crimean Tatars were not even allowed to move freely within the settlements or villages where they lived after the deportation. But Crimean Tatars continued their resistance. We established our movement, one of the first civil rights movement in the Soviet Union, which was born in exile. It relied on several key principles. First, it was peaceful, and it was non-violent. Second interesting characteristic of this movement is that it covered the majority of people, and the main aim was to return to homeland. We also call this deportation as a genocide. It was recognized as genocide by the parliaments of Ukraine, Czech Republic, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Canada, and Poland, if I'm not mistaken. For us, this is a clear genocide because there was a clear intent and purpose of eliminating a particular group based solely on their ethnicity. After the USSR collapsed in 1991, Crimean Tatar began returning massively. By the mid-90s, about 250,000 returned. But there were challenges. The people who had settled in their homes after 1944 didn't want to give anything back. Authorities blocked land purchases and housing registration, and many Crimean Tatars had no citizenship. Again, myself, until 10 years, like 10 years after I was born, I was considered as apatride or a person without any citizenship. There were many barriers to access to work, to labor market, and it took years of advocacy to change regional legislation and even national legislation to allow the stateless deportees to become citizens, to start their journey towards some basic rights, which is right to home, right to be just to feel yourself as someone who can live in their own home and feel like a human. Despite all these challenges, we managed to rebuild our way of life. We managed to preserve our language. One of the main achievements for Crimean Tatars I see as the re-establishment of representative institutions, which are Kurultai and Mejlis. These are self-governing bodies, like indigenous government, which is two-tier. It consists of National Assembly, Kurultai, which is akin to parliament, and the Mejlis, which is similar to the government, and the Mejlis should implement the decisions of Kurultai. And just a year before the 2014 annexation, in 2013, there were first direct elections to Kurultai, and according to several data, like estimates, more than 50% of Crimean Tatars participated in these elections. So it was a parallel structure which was not prohibited by law, but at the same time was not officially recognized. We also managed to open schools, media, but then, as you probably know, then came 2014 and Russia invaded Crimea. In 2016, the Mejlis, our self-governing body and institution, was banned. Activists were massively jailed. Disappearances began. The first person to be tortured and killed after the start of occupation in the first day was Crimean Tatar, who stood up against the occupation. He was just abducted, and then his body was found several days after. It was Reshat Ametov. So Russian policies in Crimea since the occupation of 2014, their entire aim is to erase Crimean Tatar identity. And I would add that every non-Russian identity. And this policy is very persistent, consistent. It works in several dimensions. For example, during his speech in March 2014, the president of Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, was asked whether Crimean Tatars would be recognized as indigenous people. And then his answer was that there are many other ethnic groups who can also claim their indigeneity within Crimea, including perhaps Russians. But, it set the tone of how Russia continued their policy towards Crimean Tatars. Then was the ban, as I already mentioned, of the representative institution, their activities. It's a total ban and prohibition of any activity. So this Majlis, our Majlis, it had regional branches. It had more than 2,000 deputies within itself in the regions, in the districts, and also suppressing education. If you look at the statistics given by Russia, you can see very fancy figures and numbers of school children who learn Crimean Tatar language, or even more, existence of Crimean Tatar schools. But the truth is that there is no infrastructure, adequate infrastructure like books. The Crimean Tatar language is not spoken in these schools. And the main reason is the general atmosphere of intimidation. I received several testimonies from parents of children who, applied to school specifically so their children can learn Crimean Tatar and or learn several subjects in their native language, and these parents, they were also intimidated and said that they were told that if they proceed with this, if they continue demanding their right to educate their children in native language, then they will face, and their children will face consequences with the school administration. Today, Crimean Tatars face something that we call hybrid deportation. It is when the conditions that are created within Crimea are so unbearable that you choose either you choose to continue living on your homeland, but without any adequate possibility and rights implementation to express yourself, your identity, your language, or you just leave Crimea. So today, instead of trains, it's legal pressure, it's discrimination and fear. We often call Crimea as a peninsula of fear after 2014 occupation. So Russia tries to erase the presence of indigenous peoples, not suddenly, but slowly. We call this occupation as a violation of international law, but what's more than that, this is a continuation of colonial violence. And today, indigenous Crimeans have two somewhat conflicting goals. First is to survive, and second is to develop. After 2014, around 25 to 30,000 Crimean Tatars displaced to non-occupied territories of Ukraine, mostly to Kiev. And we continued our advocacy in order to establish the conditions so that Crimean Tatar identity language institutions could survive and continue their activities. For example, we are in a dialogue with the Ukrainian state. In 2018, we started working on a model of autonomy, which is the way to implement our right to self-determination as indigenous peoples under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there are several key principles that we demand from this autonomy. First is the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Second is guaranteed representation of indigenous peoples in Crimean institutions. And third, this is, if I can tell this way, like a Bible for indigenous peoples all over the world, is free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples. So no decisions about our future can be made without our voice. And we see this future autonomy as a form of decolonization for the future of Crimea. If we accept that 1944 genocide was also known as Surgunlik in our language, it was a genocide, then we must also accept that the need to undo, to reverse its consequences. And yeah, colonization, I think it is like not just about taking land, it's also about breaking identity, which Russia continues to do and carry out through their policies in Crimea. And like we are Crimean Tatars, we are still here. We are rebuilding, reclaiming, and determined to ensure that no one else suffers the same fate. I can also add a couple of words about the situation after the start of full-scale invasion of Russia in 2022, because the repressive policies became even harsher. And in 2022, 2023, in Crimea, even singing a song, for example, in Ukrainian, could lead or still can lead to detention without any reason. I can also bring an interesting example of a Crimean Tatar newspaper that published the report of the United Nations Secretary General about the human rights situation in Crimea. And for this newspaper was fined. So there was an administrative penalty imposed on this newspaper for abusing the freedom of speech. There is a particular article in the legislation of Russian Federation, which is abusing the freedom of spreading mass information, which means that the same way the UN Secretary General could also be fined because of the things and realities that he outlined in his report about the situation with human rights in Crimea. I think this is the main line I was going to tell, and thank you again for inviting me, for listening, and I will be really happy to answer your questions if you have any of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mamutov. Actually, before opening for the audience, I would like to make some questions, because this is an important thing for me, and I've been researching about it a bit due to my PhD, which was not the main theme. However, it touched the Crimean Tatars issue, and I have some things that I would like to add and actually question you. The first thing is that it's interesting for us that like 2 days from the Eurovision finals, we are talking about the Crimean Tatars here, which was the first prize Ukraine won in Eurovision. Isn't that so? 1944, the song from Jamala won I think 2018, 2016 Eurovision, which is a song that with poetry explains the ethnic cleansing that the Crimean Tatars suffered during the Stalin times. The main thing that I would like to ask you is that how today, I'm not good with Tatar, so I must apologize firstly. How is for the Majlis,
Yeah.
which is the Tatar organization, Tatar ethnic organization inside the Crimea? How is for the Majlis today to be under Russian occupation, and how does it work in Ukraine, continental Ukraine, let's say?
Thank you for your question. So yes, the key leadership of the Majlis, our indigenous government, moved to Kiev, to the uh, to the territory of Ukraine that thanks still is under the control of Ukrainian government and will be and this will continue, I believe. So in 2016, Russia prohibits the activities of Majlis, and Russia recognized or announced Majlis as an extremist organization. The Majlis in Kiev, after moving to Kiev, they continued their activity in several areas. First is the political area or sphere, which is aimed at non-recognition, like reinforcing and promoting non-recognition policy with regard to the occupation of Crimea. And second, claiming the rights of Crimean Tatars as indigenous people. The first is political. The second is the fact that Majlis was actively involved into the process of developing laws, legislation in general on indigenous peoples of Ukraine, because in 2014, Crimean Tatars were recognized, obtained, they were given this status. And in 2021, Ukraine adopted a law on indigenous peoples. In 2022, I was also part of this process. The government of Ukraine also adopted a strategy on developing Crimean Tatar language, and Majlis was actively involved into the process of developing it, formulating it, giving the proposals, and one of the achievements is that, for example, one of the elements of this policy was already implemented, because Crimean Tatar language last year it was added to one of the most popular online translators, which is Google Translate, and this was preceded by very long work on creating the online corpuses of language. So the second area of work for the Majlis is preservation of identity, language, and culture. Yeah, I think the third one is help and contribute to the monitoring of the situation with the human rights in the occupied Crimea, because while I have no possibility since 2022 to go to my homeland and visit my relatives, for example, and see how the situation evolves in the occupied Crimea, we still have many friends, relatives, the network of activists who share information, who tell the truth, even despite many risks and challenges. And Majlis is one of the actors in this activity that really assists in building this or preserving this links and connections with the Crimea, even despite the fact that we have no direct access there. But still, we do not have exact figures, but I think that more than 200,000, maybe 250,000 Crimean Tatars continue living in Crimea. And this is, by the way, one of the problems that we faced as people after the start of full-scale invasion, because I mentioned this hybrid deportation, and this process, it really made a peak or was reinforced after the full-scale invasion, because in September 2022, Russia started its drafting campaign, or mobilizing new soldiers to its army. And not only Crimean Tatars, but many indigenous peoples in Russia, in territories that, like in internationally recognized territories of Russia, indigenous peoples there in occupied territories, Crimean Tatars, they were the first one to be conscripted to Russian army to invade Ukraine. And this resulted in new waves of massive displacement of Crimean Tatars. And the problem is that we do not know exactly how many of us still live in Crimea after this. We know that we have large diasporas in Germany, in Ireland, in Turkey, all over the world. But yeah, we have no credible sources of information about how many left Crimea. And this is also something that creates a challenge for us in maintaining connections among Crimean Tatars around the globe, and the second, preserving identity in exile.
So you're saying that sort of 1944 happened again in the 20s, in the 2020s, because while the men were fighting, well, in 1944, while the men were fighting the Red Army, women and children suffered the diaspora, so on, the ethnic cleansing. And so you're saying that almost something like this, sort of this pattern happened again in the 2020s, isn't it? I have some more questions, such as, well, forgive me for the Tatar again, but Mr. Mustafa Cemilev Kirimoglu, I think that's how I say, since the 90s, well, a bit earlier earlier before it, was defending the Tatar cause and trying to achieve the indigenous recognition by Ukraine. This recognition, however, as you said, juridically speaking, happened only after the annexation. Is there any reason why? And well, this for the moment, and then I have another question.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a really great question, I think. So yeah, we have a very famous Crimean Tatar. His name is Mustafa Cemilev. He was a Soviet dissident, and he spent more than 20 years in prisons for publicly protecting our right to return to homeland after the deportation. And as I told, our national movement, our movement for return, it started like the next day after the deportation was carried out by Soviet regime. But yeah, Soviet authorities, they didn't want us to come back to return, and there were a number of reasons why it was impossible. And those who fought, who struggled for return, who were most active, they spent many years in prisons just for voicing the aspirations of the entire people to come back to our land. And it became, such a kind of a dream for the whole generation. For example, for my parents, the main objective in their life was to return to Crimea, although they never seen it. Mustafa Cemilev was the leader of this movement for return. After we returned to Crimea, as I told, there were parallel structures which were not banned by Ukrainian authorities, but also they were not officially recognized. And I can accept that there were many challenges that we faced after our return to Crimea, and that Ukrainian state could solve in a more faster way could solve more efficiently. But the main thing that, there was a dialogue, a political process between our indigenous government, the Majlis, and the government of Ukraine. And there were several programs or policies for integration of Crimean Tatars after they returned to Crimean society, to Ukrainian society. Maybe I can criticize these policies for the lack of resources, but still there was some arrangement and there was some framework for us to we saw the future because there was a dialogue. And yes, Ukraine recognized us as an indigenous people only after the attempt of annexation, after the occupation was started by Russia. This may seem as truly realpolitik and political reasons, because Crimean Tatars massively opposed the occupation. They ignored this fake referendum organized by Russia for joining, as they call it, Russia. And Crimean Tatars were seen as the main force that in Crimea, as the main actor and force, collective force that that protected or that claimed the territorial integrity of Ukraine should be preserved. But for us, this was something natural because in 1990s, we joined and actively participated in the global movement for the rights of indigenous peoples. And the rights of indigenous peoples, they stem from the fundamental principles of international law and international human rights law. And for us, it was quite natural and logical when you defend and your right, when you struggle for your rights, if you rely on international law, on one of its bodies, then you cannot disregard or ignore other key and fundamental principles of international law, which is also territorial integrity. So yeah, on the one hand, I regret that this recognition happened many years after Ukraine regained its independence. But on the other hand, I also would like to tell you, this 2014 recognition of us as indigenous peoples, as people by Ukraine, it was not done from scratch. Many years of our advocacy work and dialogue with the Ukrainian government, with the Ukrainian state, was in the first place, and this was the main cause. This was not something out of blue or that was just imagined or invented as a fast response to the occupation of Russia. Because as I told, it took us many years to advocate for this, and we had a profound base on which we could rely. And again, there was a dialogue with the state, unlike with Russia, where there is no dialogue, where Crimean Tatars were given a very straightforward choice that either you support us or we'll do everything we can in order to erase you and starting from your identity. That's how I'd like to respond to this question.
Thank you very much. I have just one last question, which is what about the Tatar language? Because I have researched that during mainly during Ukrainian independence times, the Tatar language was not completely fading, but as a cultural language, it lost some space to Russian or Ukrainian due to theater, cinema, and other instances, books or whatever. So I would like to ask you how this recognition of the importance of the language and rebirth of the language, if I may speak, is going on today.
Well, again, thank you for a question. I think, yeah, the situation with language can be viewed based on where it, like on the territory that we look at. If you look if you look at Crimea, if we focus on Crimea, the general atmosphere of repressions and intimidation, it restricts considerably the willingness to express yourself or part of your identity through the language. And what I witnessed when I visited Crimea last time is that many Crimean Tatars, even those who know their language on a decent level, they, or when I spoke, for example, with children, tried to speak with children in native language, that I've seen that there is a pattern where, or behavioral pattern, where people started to afraid to speak in their language, because perhaps they were waiting for some because this associates with the risks. And I went to one of the playgrounds in Akmesjid, which is also known as Simferopol, with my daughter in a district where Crimean Tatars predominantly live and inhabit this district. And I at one point I understood that, or I saw the picture where my daughter was the only one in the playground who like loudly spoke. She was 3 years old, loudly spoke in her native language. This was something natural for her, which I practice here in Kiev with her. But for many my compatriots, for many Crimean Tatars, this was really something, strange and weird, because they after the occupation, after several years of occupation, they didn't get used to the situation when you can freely use your language. And yes, unfortunately, Crimean Tatar language is listed, or it was included into the list of severely endangered languages, which means that there is a break of transition of language from one generation to another. And sometimes I think that this situation is really dire or really awful, because less people can speak, less people use their language, and this is something that, of course, started with deportation, because during deportation, Crimean Tatars could not take even their personal belongings with them to the places of, like, to Central Asia. And I'm not telling about any books. So it took us many years to revive our media, to revive so the authors could, or newspapers, books. So yeah, and for language to survive and to be preserved, the main thing, or the main element, is the language infrastructure, which was completely destroyed as a result of deportation. So on the one hand, I understand that the situation is really bad, because sometimes I think that maybe there is no hope to revive the language to the extent that it was before the genocide. On the other hand, I think that in these circumstances, the very fact that there are many Crimean Tatars like who can speak, that we have books, that we have preserved our even alphabet, that we have preserved our grammar, that we could uh, fix it in writing after the genocide. It gives me a glimpse of hope that maybe someday I will see, or the next generations, they could revive language and speak it freely and express themselves through their native language. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind answers. And I would like to apologize for monopolizing the questioning. We have some questions from our viewers. I have one here from Siddhartha Martins, and he's asking you if you think that with Ukraine regaining de jure control of Crimea, is there any potential of the Crimean Tatars of returning to the how can I say it, status quo ante, and revive their native structure and language, culture, and so on?
Well, thanks for the question. I think that as long as occupation continues, we have no hopes for adequate revival of our identity, of our language, of our culture. But maybe we'll still, maybe we will be able to manage, we will manage to preserve it at some level. If Ukraine regains its control, both de facto and de jure, over the peninsula, this, of course, gives us many more tools and possibilities and opportunities to revive our language. Because, as I told, during the last 10 years or 11 years after the start of occupation, Ukraine adopted many laws and bylaws, the implementing legislation. So, like, there is a framework that can be operationalized, and Ukraine and Crimean Tatars, our indigenous government, started operationalizing it, but it can be implemented in full only in our homeland. So, yes, I believe that the precondition for our normal development and even existence as people is liberation of Crimea. At the same time, I understand that there is a discourse, of many people. They do not believe that Crimea will ever be liberated and that Russia will cease its occupation. But I also believe that every occupation is temporary, and that one day or another we will be able to return to our homes and feel like we are in home, where you can feel yourself as a Crimean Tatar, because home is not only the roof and four walls near you. It's some place where you can feel, where you can find a refuge, where you can speak your language without fear, where you can born, live, and die as yourself, as with your identity, and where you will not be put at risk for being someone who is undesirable for the authority.
Thank you very much. Due to time issues, I'm gonna pass the words for our co-hosts, our co-organizers, Professor Paulo Casala. If you have any words, please, to share.
Thank you, Felipe. Suleiman, thank you so much for bringing us not only the information, but we could feel that it was coming straight from the heart. So it is heartfelt. It is something that you live and suffer, and we appreciate you sharing with us this bunch of lies that are built by the Soviet formerly and now the Russian occupation, covering up the existence of the Crimean Tatars, the language, the culture, and the possibility to lead a peaceful life in your homeland. So this is moving and important, and this is a contribution to the work we have been doing along the latest 5 years on the Permanent Forum on Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity. It is not the first time this issue was mentioned. You see that Felipe is quite familiar with the topic, and there's probably not many people in Brazil that have collected as much information on this issue as he did. And it is important that we keep in touch, and maybe in the near future you can be with us again and bring some new information. So thank you so much, and we hope we keep in touch and go on working together.
Thank you for having me and inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Professor Arthur Capella, if you have any words or thoughts to share, please.
Thank you, Felipe, and Professor Suleiman Mamutov. Thank you for your presentation or lecture. I completely agree with Professor Paulo that your contributions are moving and important contribution to the work of Fórum. I have learned a lot of information and challenges you mentioned, and so I only want to thank you. Thank you for your instructive presentation.
Good.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Mamutov. It was a pleasure to hear such, as Professor Casala said, your words from the heart and the grievings of the Crimean Tatars people. It's very important for us to know more about this history, which happened during the 40s, but still happening today. And that's it. If you have your final words, your final greetings for the day, it's a pleasure to hear from you.
I would like, first of all, thank you for inviting me and for listening, and thank you, Felipe, for your questions. I was really, I'm not even surprised, but astonished with the level of awareness of the problem that Crimean Tatars face. Thank you all for inviting me again, Paulo, Artur, Felipe. It was really a pleasure to share, and I thank you for your interest and for time that you took to listen to this story.
Thank you again for enlightening us with this story. Now, a few words in Portuguese for our audience. Pessoal, muito obrigado pela presença de vocês hoje aqui no nosso evento. Não percam, nos próximos meses teremos mais eventos como esse, sempre anunciados pelas nossas mídias. Acompanhem a gente no nosso canal no YouTube, acompanhem-nos no Instagram e que vocês poderão saber de antemão quais são os nossos próximos tópicos. Então, sem mais delongas, agradeço mais uma vez a presença do professor Suleiman Mamutov. Agradeço também o senhor Oscar por fazer essa conexão possível. E muito obrigado a todos e todas. Encerro aqui o nosso evento de hoje, do mês de maio, e conto com a presença de vocês para os nossos próximos eventos. Até lá!